Welcome. Thank you for tuning in. It's a beautiful fall day. I'm in Pennsylvania, and quite remarkable, the beauty of the fall. See that behind me is some nasturtiums that I planted. They do not grow. They're not perennials. I plant them in. And they last through the all the way to the first frost. So it's very colorful here in Pennsylvania. Today we're talking about the healing process. These are a group of presentations on treatment. And what we have come to understand is that having insight into how an emotional wound is generated, how it's sustained, and then how it's treated provides the actual understanding of what is occurring. And many of us have in our time taken these psychosocial inventories, and we look at our lives and record events that occurred in our early life. And what is so important about that practice is that we need to look at those events and then translate them into the probable schemas, the mental patterns that have been generated from them. So our early experience results in a self-conception. That self-conception is currently operative. We have built it up. You have a worldview also that was generated early up in your life, and you're operating to some extent through that worldview associated with your self-concept, in that there are values that have been determined, and the intellect is now pretty much directed towards those values, and memory is sustaining this apparent stability, which is part of our the personhood, our own personhood. So we are interested in liberation from psychological suffering. So again, insight into the nature of our emotional wounds is helpful. It provides us an understanding of what might be occurring here today. Today we're going to look at mindful exposure to disturbances, and I'm suggesting to you that this is one perspective towards the healing process. The healing process, the healing of our emotional wounds. When the emotional wound is triggered, there is contraction, a sense of anxiety. There is if you will, a fear response in that anxiety, and we lose our flow, so to speak, when we have that contraction. It's actually a defense that kicks up, and it's as a result of early maladjusted schemas. Schemas, for example, of abandonment, the anxiety about being deserted. Many youngsters have indeed been exposed to circumstances that allow abandonment to develop as an ongoing, entrenched, maladjusted schema, and it feels as if there is no other life, but in fact the abandonment schema, the impression that in the end you'll be alone, is in fact a thought. It is an idea, and it is not equivalent to, if you will, the principle known as reality. we actually are superimposing these ideas, for example, the idea of abandonment, on reality. So that is one type of emotional wound. Emotional deprivation is something that many of us have been exposed to. We have endured deprivation of empathy from very important people in our lives, and we may have endured a deprivation of being nurtured, built up by our parents. They may have been busy, or they may have been distracted, or perhaps even incompetent for many reasons, and we also might have had a exposure to a deprivation of protection. These leave echoes, if you will, in consciousness. They echo into the current moment. They are, in fact, being delivered by the mind into the current moment. These are part of the value systems. Many of us have been preoccupied with our insecurities. That preoccupation is costly because it is indeed an occupation, and it tends to supplant the natural course of inquiry that our personalities would make. In other words, your anxiety distracts you from your intrinsic leanings, your intrinsic capacities, your aptitudes, your preferences. So this is why insight is important. Again, it's the understanding that these historical events are somehow in potential and from time to time triggered in the current moment, resulting in psychological suffering. So we talked about these two schemas. Of course, there are more. You might have been exposed to abuse, and the idea that something is wrong with you, also that you may be unlovable, that you are inadequate in finding love and turning parents around. You might have had that experience as a youngster, couldn't really turn your parents around, could not get them to be respectful towards you, to cherish you in the way that you needed that to occur. And with that, we are in that paradigm, that model, that projection, even here, even now. So that's our situation. So the liberation from psychological suffering is, in fact, a liberation from what the mind is delivering. The wounds and the circumstances are not currently happening, yet you can still get the contraction when it is associated with circumstances in your day-to-day life that trigger this insecurity. The recovery process looks like meditation. And in other words, what we do is we isolate those feelings by degree, by sitting still, learning to calm the mind, and we begin to witness our emotional wounds. Now, witnessing and experiencing are certainly related. We are experiencing them, but we are trained to develop psychological distance, and that is a healing principle. It was suggested by Dr. Aaron Beck. Psychological distance, very much like a bell going off. If you're right onto the bell, you're really resonating with that bell. You get greater distance from the bell. When the bell rings, you're less influenced by it. We want to reduce the influence of our emotional wounds so that behavior is not driven by the emotional wound itself, so that fear or anxiety is not driving our behavior. We accept our emotional wounds completely in this approach. What we also do is that we decenter. Decenter means you do not take it personally. And that has so much to do with the meditative placement of attention. The meditative placement of attention is a decentered awareness. It's a decentered awareness. Things are no longer reviewed as personal. It's not a story about ourselves. And that has a great deal to do with the meditative placement of attention. It undermines by degree the feeling that there is a subject-object relationship. There's a feeling that there is a collapse. Radical acceptance can provide for the collapsing of the subject-object relationship, the perceiver and the object of perception. And again, we have to ask the question, what is the therapeutic value of doing that? Well, that is the decentering process. What does that mean? Well, it means that it is nature that is occurring. It is a perspective that may be characterized as it is as it is, rather than it is as it should be. Our emotional wounds and our disturbances are related to our worldview, that view being it is as it should be. In other words, it becomes an ideal, something about you that you'd like to see, or something about the world that you need. So the meditative placement of attention is a meta-perception. It is a perspective that decenters you from events that occur, from schemas. Schemas are mental patterns. We still have them, but we respond differently. So responding differently to your emotional wound, to your complex, is the liberation process. And I would suggest to you that really getting to understand this basic principle is truly helpful. Truly helpful. In other words, your thoughts continue to come into awareness. However, you review them. You review these thoughts, and some of them are certainly not worth investing in. We don't want to identify with them because they do not serve us. They are remnants of the past, and the mind has its job. It delivers this information into awareness. So we are talking about the treatment mindful exposure to disturbances, and that is exactly what occurs automatically, and we call it disturbances. I'm disturbed by this feeling, this thought, this syndrome coming over me. What we do in mindfulness-based anxiety reduction is we deliberately trigger the images that would disturb us. And we respond to them by insulating them by observation. Rather than fear, we have interest, and we also accommodate them. We give them a place in consciousness. And then in mindful exposure to disturbances, we shift our attention away from them. This devalues them. This puts them into proportion. By the way, tolerating them, inviting them, also turns the message. It changes the message about the emotional wound. As horrific as it might be, we can tolerate it. We can start with slow exposures and increase the willingness to expose ourselves even to trauma. And we do not get re-traumatized by the exposure. As long as you approach the practice respectful